Your grandfather didn't leave you a single dollar, Evelyn. Those were the words Vanessa Parker spoke as she sat across from me in the attorney's conference room, her hands folded neatly on the polished oak table and a faint smile resting on her face. My husband, Harold, had been gone for only 3 weeks. 3 weeks since I stood beside his grave in a small Vermont cemetery while autumn leaves drifted across the grass. 3 weeks since I lost the man who had shared my life for 46 years. Yet there I was, listening to my daughter-in-law explain my future as if she were discussing the weather. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Family photographs lined the walls of Thomas Reed's law office, and sunlight filtered through the blinds. Michael, my son, sat beside Vanessa, avoiding my eyes. Thomas adjusted his glasses and continued reading the documents in front of him. Harold's estate was substantial. The family home, investment accounts, several pieces of land Harold had purchased decades ago. Yet as the reading continued, one thing became painfully clear. Almost everything appeared to be passing directly to Michael. I sat quietly. No tears. No arguments. No dramatic questions. That surprised Vanessa. I could see it in the way she occasionally glanced toward me, expecting a reaction that never came. The truth was that I was too confused to react. Harold was many things, but careless was not one of them. He planned everything. Every insurance policy. Every retirement account. Every tax document neatly organized in labeled folders. For years he had repeated the same sentence whenever we discussed the future. You'll always be protected, Evie. Hearing that promise echo in my memory made what I was seeing feel impossible. When the meeting ended, Vanessa stood first. At least everything is settled now, she said lightly. Michael finally looked at me. Mom, are you okay? I smiled softly. I'm fine. It wasn't entirely true, but it was all I wanted to say. Outside, the October air felt colder than I expected. I drove home slowly along the winding roads that Harold loved. The mountains were covered in shades of gold and red. Every turn reminded me of him. Every familiar landmark carried a memory. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was already beginning to set. The house felt larger without him. Quieter. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and stood there for several minutes listening to the silence. Eventually, I made myself a cup of tea and carried it upstairs to our bedroom. Harold's side of the room remained untouched. His reading chair still sat beside the window. A sweater hung neatly over the armrest. I lowered myself onto the edge of the bed and stared across the room. That was when I noticed something unusual. The old wooden jewelry box on Harold's dresser sat slightly open. At first I thought nothing of it. Then I remembered that Harold rarely touched that box. Curious, I walked over and lifted the lid. Inside were only a few ordinary items. A watch, some cufflinks, a handful of old photographs. But hidden beneath a folded handkerchief was a small brass key attached to a faded white tag. My heart began to beat a little faster. Harold had always been meticulous. He never left random objects lying around. I turned the key over in my hand. No address. No explanation. No note. Just a single handwritten number on the tag, 117. I searched every drawer in the bedroom that evening. Every cabinet. Every lock in the house. The key fit nothing. Hours passed. Darkness settled outside the windows. Finally, I sat alone in Harold's chair, staring at the small brass key resting in my palm. Somewhere, somehow, Harold had wanted me to find it. And for the first time since leaving the attorney's office, I began to wonder if the story I had been told that morning was not the whole truth. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, something I had done almost every day during the years Harold was alive. For a few seconds, lying beneath the quilt we had shared for decades, I forgot everything. Then I looked toward the empty side of the bed, and reality settled over me again. The key was still on the nightstand where I had left it. Small, ordinary, easy to overlook. Yet I could not shake the feeling that Harold had placed it in that jewelry box for a reason. I carried it downstairs and set it beside my coffee mug. The kitchen window overlooked the backyard where Harold had spent countless weekends tending his garden. Even in October, traces of color remained among the flower beds. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug and found myself remembering a conversation we had shared nearly 2 years earlier. We had been sitting on the porch watching a summer storm roll across the hills. Harold had grown unusually serious that evening. He stared toward the horizon and said, "If anything ever feels wrong, Evie, do not stop asking questions." At the time, I laughed and asked what he meant. He simply smiled and changed the subject. I had forgotten that moment until now. The memory lingered with me throughout the day. Around noon, Michael called. His voice sounded careful, almost rehearsed. He asked how I was doing and whether I needed help with anything around the house. I thanked him and told him I was managing fine. There was an awkward pause before he spoke again. "Mom, I know yesterday was difficult." I glanced at the key resting on the counter. "Was it?" I asked quietly. Another pause followed. "I just mean everything happening so fast after Dad passed away." I could hear uncertainty in his voice. Not guilt exactly, more like confusion. Before hanging up, he mentioned that Vanessa wanted to stop by later in the week. Something about that immediately made me uneasy. Vanessa had never shown much interest in visiting unless there was a specific reason. After the call ended, I spent the afternoon searching through Harold's study. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Every shelf reflected his orderly nature. Tax records sat in neat rows. Family photographs occupied the corners of his desk. I opened folders, examined notebooks, and checked drawers. Nothing. No mention of a key. No reference to the number attached to the tag. By evening, frustration began replacing curiosity. Perhaps I was imagining connections that did not exist. Perhaps grief was making me search for meaning where there was none. Yet that explanation never felt right. Harold was deliberate in everything he did. The following morning, I drove into town to run errands. While waiting in line at the bank, my gaze drifted toward a row of secure deposit boxes behind a locked door. Something stirred in my memory. Years ago, Harold had mentioned renting a box for important documents. I had never paid much attention because he handled most financial matters himself. My heartbeat quickened. The number on the key tag suddenly seemed less random than before. 117. I approached the customer service desk and asked a few careful questions. The employee could not discuss account information, but she confirmed that certain deposit box keys carried numbered tags similar to the one I described. I thanked her and walked back toward my car, trying to remain calm. The autumn wind tugged at my coat as I stood in the parking lot staring at the key in my hand. For the first time, I had a direction. For the first time since the reading of the will, a small crack appeared in the story I had been told. And somewhere deep inside, I began to suspect that Harold had not left me unprotected after all. I did not go home immediately. Instead, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes, parked beneath a maple tree whose leaves were turning brilliant shades of orange and gold. The key rested in my palm. Small pieces of metal are not supposed to change the way a person sees the world, yet that was exactly what had happened. Until that moment, I had been trying to accept what everyone else seemed ready to believe. Harold was gone. The documents had been read. The decisions had been made. Life was supposed to move forward. But now there was a question sitting quietly beneath all of it, and I could not ignore it. The next morning, I returned to the bank shortly after opening. The same woman from customer service greeted me with a polite smile. I explained that my husband had recently passed away and that I was trying to determine whether he had maintained any deposit boxes with the institution. She listened carefully before asking for identification and a copy of the death certificate. The process took nearly 40 minutes. Most of that time was spent waiting in a small office while employees reviewed records. I watched people come and go through the lobby. Retirees depositing checks. Parents carrying toddlers. Business owners discussing loans. Ordinary lives continuing while mine felt suspended between the past and something I could not yet understand. Finally, the bank manager entered the room carrying a folder. He introduced himself and sat across from me. His expression was professional but noticeably curious. "Mrs. Parker," he said, "your husband did maintain a safe deposit box here." My pulse quickened. "Does the number happen to be 117? For the first time, his eyebrows lifted slightly. "Yes," he replied. I stared at him without speaking. The manager continued explaining the legal requirements. Because Harold had passed away, certain procedures had to be completed before access could be granted. Some paperwork would need verification. Additional documents would need to be reviewed. The process might take several days. Under normal circumstances, that would have frustrated me. Instead, I felt relief. The key was real. The number was real. Whatever Harold had hidden, it actually existed. As I prepared to leave, the manager glanced down at the file once more. "There is something unusual," he said. I stopped. "What do you mean?" He hesitated before answering. Most safe deposit boxes contain standard estate planning materials. Your husband requested several special instructions regarding access. Very detailed instructions. Harold had always been thorough. Still, hearing that made my curiosity grow stronger. On the drive home, memories surfaced one after another. Harold sitting at the kitchen table reviewing paperwork late at night. Harold making notes inside legal pads. Harold insisting that important documents should never be left where the wrong people could find them. At the time, I assumed he was simply being cautious. Now those habits seemed to carry a different meaning. That afternoon, my phone rang. Vanessa. Her name appeared on the screen, and immediately I felt tension settle into my shoulders. I considered letting the call go to voicemail, but eventually answered. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. She asked whether she could stop by the house the following day. Something about her tone felt rehearsed. Too careful. Too interested. I agreed without revealing anything about the bank. After the call ended, I stood at the kitchen window watching the sun sink behind the trees. For weeks, grief had clouded every thought. Now another feeling had begun taking shape beneath it. Determination. Someone had expected me to accept the story without asking questions. Someone had expected me to quietly move on. As evening settled across the property, I placed the brass key back onto the table and studied it once more. Whatever waited inside box 117, Harold had trusted me to find it. And soon, I would finally discover why. Evelyn spent the next morning moving through the house more slowly than usual. The waiting was the hardest part. The bank had confirmed the existence of the deposit box, but confirmation was not the same thing as answers. She folded laundry that did not need folding. She watered plants that had already been watered the day before. Every task felt like an attempt to keep her hands busy while her mind raced ahead. Shortly after noon, a silver SUV pulled into the driveway. Vanessa stepped out carrying a paper bag from a local bakery and wearing the same polished smile she seemed to reserve for situations where she wanted something. Evelyn greeted her at the door and invited her inside. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon. For several minutes, the conversation stayed comfortably on the surface. Vanessa asked about the house. She asked whether Evelyn was sleeping well. She asked whether there was anything she needed. The concern sounded sincere at first, but something underneath it felt strained. Eventually, Vanessa set down her coffee cup and glanced around the room. "Have you started organizing Harold's papers yet?" she asked casually. Evelyn looked up. "Not really. There must be quite a lot to sort through." "There is." Vanessa nodded. "Legal documents can be confusing. Michael and I were thinking we could help if you want." The offer sounded generous, yet Evelyn noticed how carefully Vanessa watched her reaction. It was not the expression of someone offering assistance. It was the expression of someone searching for information. The conversation continued for another half hour. Several times, Vanessa steered it back toward Harold's office, his files, and whether Evelyn had discovered anything unusual among his belongings. By the time she finally left, Evelyn felt more certain of one thing than ever before. Vanessa was worried about something. That evening, Evelyn returned to Harold's study. The room seemed different now, not because anything had changed, but because she was looking at it through a different lens. She examined shelves she had ignored before. She opened books Harold rarely touched. She reviewed old calendars stacked neatly inside a cabinet. Most contained nothing important. Then, tucked between two binders on a lower shelf, she found a small notebook. The cover was plain black leather. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, many related to investments, property maintenance, and routine financial matters. Near the middle of the notebook, one entry caught her attention. It was dated almost 18 months earlier. Harold had written only a single sentence. "Make sure Thomas keeps the secondary file separate." Evelyn read the line 3 times. Secondary file. The words echoed in her thoughts. During the reading of the will, Thomas Reed had reviewed only one collection of documents. Harold had always been meticulous. The idea that he might have maintained separate files suddenly seemed entirely possible. She sat back in Harold's chair and stared at the notebook resting on her lap. Outside, darkness settled over the property. The wind rattled branches against the windows. Somewhere in town, a bank employee was processing paperwork connected to box 117. Somewhere, answers were waiting. Evelyn closed the notebook carefully and placed it beside the brass key. For weeks, she had felt as though events were happening around her while she struggled to keep pace. That feeling was beginning to fade. Piece by piece, small details were forming a pattern. And for the first time since Harold's passing, she felt that she was moving toward the truth instead of away from it. 3 days later, the call finally came. I was trimming dead branches from one of Harold's rose bushes when my cell phone rang. The number belonged to the bank. The manager explained that the paperwork review had been completed and that I could come in the following morning. After we ended the call, I stood in the cool autumn air holding the phone in one hand and the pruning shears in the other. For weeks, uncertainty had followed me everywhere. Now I was less than 24 hours away from answers. That night, sleep came in short fragments. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined what might be waiting inside box 117. Important documents. Family records. Perhaps nothing significant at all. Yet deep down, I knew Harold had never been a man who created elaborate precautions without purpose. The following morning, gray clouds hung low over the Vermont hills as I drove into town. The bank manager greeted me personally and escorted me through a secured hallway toward the vault area. The walls were quiet and cold. The entire place felt removed from the outside world. He stopped beside a small private room containing a table and 2 chairs. A few moments later, an employee arrived carrying a long metal box. The number attached to it matched the number on my key tag. My heartbeat quickened. The employee left. The manager offered a polite smile and closed the door behind him. Suddenly, I was alone. For several seconds, I simply stared at the box. Then I reached forward and inserted the brass key. The lock turned smoothly. Inside were several neatly organized folders, a sealed envelope, and a smaller lockbox. Everything was arranged with Harold's familiar precision. I recognized it instantly. He had packed it himself. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the envelope. Across the front, written in Harold's handwriting, were 4 words. For Evelyn. Read first. The sight of his handwriting hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, grief washed over me all over again. I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The first lines immediately caught my attention. Harold wrote that if I was reading the letter, certain events had unfolded exactly as he feared they might. He apologized for keeping secrets, but explained that he believed secrecy was necessary. As I continued reading, my confusion grew. Several paragraphs referred to a separate legal structure he had established years earlier. He repeatedly mentioned Thomas Reed and something called the secondary file. The exact phrase from the notebook. My eyes moved faster across the page. Harold instructed me not to discuss the contents of the box with anyone until I had spoken directly with Thomas. Not Michael. Not Vanessa. No one. He emphasized that point twice. Then I opened the first folder. Inside were copies of legal documents unlike any I had seen during the reading of the will. Names. Signatures. Account information. Multiple pages bearing Thomas Reed's signature. I spent nearly an hour reviewing everything. The more I read, the clearer one fact became. The documents presented during the estate meeting had not told the entire story. Not even close. Eventually, I opened the smaller lockbox. Inside sat a flash drive and another sealed envelope. This envelope contained only a single sheet of paper. At the center of the page was a phone number written beside a handwritten note. Call Thomas. Use this number only. I stared at the page for a long time. When I finally left the bank, the sky had begun to clear. Sunlight broke through the clouds and reflected across the windshield of my car. For the first time since Harold's death, I no longer felt lost. I had proof that he had been planning something important. And whatever that plan was, it had not ended with the reading of his will. The moment I arrived home, I locked the front door, carried the folders into Harold's study, and sat behind his desk. The room no longer felt like a place of mourning. It felt like a place of discovery. The handwritten note with Thomas Reed's private number lay beside the telephone. For nearly 10 minutes, I stared at it. Part of me feared what I might learn. Another part feared not learning it at all. Finally, I picked up the receiver and dialed. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Thomas Reed speaking. Relief washed over me. Thomas, it is Evelyn Parker. Silence followed for a moment. Then his tone softened immediately. Evelyn, I have been hoping you would call. That single sentence sent a chill through me. You knew about the deposit box? I asked. Harold expected you would eventually find it, he replied. In fact, he made very specific arrangements in case that happened. I looked down at the documents spread across the desk. Then the papers from the estate meeting were not the full story. No, Thomas said carefully. They were only part of it. He explained that several years earlier, Harold had become concerned about potential disputes after his death. Nothing dramatic had happened at the time. Harold simply believed that large estates could change people. He wanted to ensure that certain assets remained protected regardless of future circumstances. As Thomas spoke, memories resurfaced. Harold insisting on private meetings with attorneys. Harold reviewing documents late into the night. Harold occasionally asking strange questions about trust structures and beneficiary protections. At the time, I assumed it was routine financial planning. Now those conversations carried entirely different meaning. What exactly did he create? I asked. Thomas paused before answering. A trust, a separate legal entity completely independent from the estate that was discussed during the reading of the will. My heart began beating faster. Why was I never told? Because Harold instructed me not to reveal its existence unless specific conditions were met. I leaned back in the chair. And what conditions were those? Another brief silence followed. If you were treated fairly and given complete access to all information, the trust would remain private for several years. If not, you were to receive the key and the instructions. I closed my eyes. Suddenly Harold's letter made perfect sense. He had not simply planned for his death. He had planned for the possibility that someone might try to control the narrative afterward. Thomas continued explaining details, but one statement stood out above everything else. The trust was not small. Harold had transferred substantial assets into it over many years. Investments, property interests, financial reserves, assets that had never appeared in the documents presented at the estate meeting. My hands tightened around the armrests. Does Michael know? I asked quietly. No, does Vanessa? Not to my knowledge. The answer lingered in the room long after he spoke it. Suddenly, several recent conversations took on new meaning. Vanessa repeatedly asking about Harold's files. Vanessa wanting to help organize paperwork. Vanessa carefully probing for information while pretending not to. Perhaps she had suspected something existed. Perhaps she had been searching for evidence. Either way, she clearly did not know the full truth. Before ending the call, Thomas made one final request. He wanted to meet in person. There were additional documents he could not discuss over the phone. He suggested a private meeting at his office 2 days later. After we hung up, I sat alone in the fading afternoon light. The study felt quiet again, yet the silence no longer carried uncertainty. It carried purpose. For weeks, I had been trying to understand why Harold appeared to have left me behind. Now I understood something far more important. Harold had been preparing for this moment long before any of us realized it was coming. And whatever waited inside the remaining files, it was clear that the truth was only beginning to emerge. 2 days later, I drove to Thomas Reed's office under a clear blue sky that seemed strangely out of place given everything unfolding beneath the surface of my life. The trees along the highway were nearly at their peak autumn colors, and under different circumstances I might have appreciated the view. Instead, my thoughts remained fixed on the trust, Harold's letter, and the questions that still had no answers. Thomas greeted me personally when I arrived. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes carried the same steady confidence Harold had always trusted. Without wasting time, he led me into a private conference room and placed a thick binder on the table between us. Everything we discussed today is supported by documentation, he said. Harold wanted facts to speak for themselves. He opened the binder and began turning pages. Trust agreements, property records, investment statements, legal correspondence. The deeper we went, the clearer the picture became. Harold had established the trust nearly 8 years earlier. Over time, he transferred significant assets into it. Several investment accounts, interests in commercial property, long-term financial holdings that had quietly grown in value year after year. None of it had been included in the estate documents presented during the reading of the will because legally it existed outside the estate entirely. I sat quietly absorbing the information. Harold had built this plan carefully and patiently. Every page revealed another layer of preparation. Then Thomas showed me something that made me stop breathing for a moment. A beneficiary page bearing my full name. Evelyn Grace Parker. Sole lifetime beneficiary. No conditions. No restrictions. No competing claims. Harold had intended those assets to protect me, and only me. He was very specific, Thomas said. He wanted to guarantee your financial independence regardless of what happened after his death. I lowered my eyes to the document. Even now, months after signing it, Harold's signature seemed unmistakably alive. Thomas continued, "There is more." He opened another section of the binder containing records of communication over the previous year. Most were routine. Then several messages caught my attention. Requests for information. Questions regarding account structures. Attempts to determine whether additional assets existed outside the estate. Every inquiry originated from the same person, Vanessa. She never directly discovered the trust, but she had clearly been searching for something. My stomach tightened. Suddenly, her behavior over the past few weeks made perfect sense. The questions, the unexpected visits, the interest in Harold's files. She had sensed there was more to the story. She simply did not know where to look. Did Harold know she was asking questions? I asked. Thomas nodded. Toward the end, yes. That was one reason he strengthened several protections. The room fell silent. For years, I had viewed Harold's careful planning as simple caution. Now I understood it differently. He had been paying attention to things I overlooked. He saw patterns before they became problems. He recognized risks before anyone else noticed them. Before I left, Thomas handed me a smaller folder. "Take this home and read it carefully," he said. "There is one final section I think Harold wanted you to discover on your own." I carried the folder to my car and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The afternoon sun reflected off the windshield. My hands rested on the unopened file. Inside, somewhere among those pages, waited the final piece of a puzzle Harold had spent years assembling. And for the first time, I suspected the biggest revelation was still ahead of me. When I finally opened the folder Thomas had given me, I expected more financial records. Instead, I found something far more personal. The first document was a letter written entirely in Harold's handwriting. Unlike the earlier note, this one was longer, slower, more reflective. I sat in my kitchen reading it while evening light faded beyond the windows. Harold explained that the trust was never about money alone. It was about protection. Over the years, he had quietly observed changes within the family. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be pointed to as a single event. Just patterns. Conversations that felt different. Priorities that shifted. Questions about assets that appeared more often than questions about people. He wrote that he trusted Michael's heart, but worried about the influence surrounding him. That sentence stayed with me for a long time. Harold never spoke harshly about anyone. If he wrote those words, he had considered them carefully. The letter continued for several pages. Then I reached a section that made me stop reading and stare out the window. Harold described a private meeting with Thomas nearly 2 years earlier. During that meeting, he instructed Thomas to document every inquiry regarding hidden assets, trust structures, and beneficiary arrangements. Attached behind the letter were copies of those records. I spent the next hour reviewing them one by one. The timeline revealed something remarkable. Nearly every inquiry originated from Vanessa. Sometimes directly, sometimes through intermediaries, sometimes disguised as routine questions. Yet together they formed a clear pattern. She had spent years trying to determine whether Harold maintained assets outside the visible estate. What she never discovered was how thoroughly Harold had prepared. The following morning, I received a text message from Michael. He wanted to stop by that weekend. Under normal circumstances, the request would have felt ordinary. Instead, it felt significant. I agreed immediately. As the week progressed, I continued reviewing the documents. More details emerged. Harold had anticipated confusion after his death. He had anticipated pressure. Most surprising of all, he had anticipated that someone might attempt to convince me that the estate documents represented the entire picture. The realization left me with mixed emotions. Part of me felt saddened that Harold had considered such possibilities. Another part felt deeply grateful. By Saturday afternoon, everything was ready. The folders sat neatly organized on my dining room table. The trust documents remained secure. Thomas had already confirmed that all legal protections were active. Nothing could be altered. Nothing could be challenged through simple manipulation. For the first time since Harold's passing, I felt calm. Around 3 o'clock, Michael arrived. Vanessa came with him. She carried a pie from a local bakery and wore the same pleasant expression she always seemed to present when entering my home. We sat together in the dining room. Small talk filled the first few minutes. Weather, work, holiday plans. Then Vanessa glanced toward the stack of folders. The movement lasted only a second, but I noticed it. So did Michael. What are those? He asked. I folded my hands on the table. Some things your father wanted me to see. The room became noticeably quieter. Vanessa's smile remained in place, but something behind it shifted. I could see curiosity, concern, perhaps even recognition. For a moment, nobody spoke. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees. Inside, the silence stretched between us. Then I looked at my son and realized that the next conversation would change everything. Because for the first time, I was no longer searching for the truth. I was holding it in my hands. Michael looked from me to the folders and back again. Mom, what is going on? He asked quietly. I opened the top folder and slid several documents across the table. Your father left instructions, I said. Very detailed instructions. Michael picked up the pages and began reading. At first, his expression showed simple confusion. Then his eyes widened. Across from him, Vanessa remained perfectly still. She did not reach for the papers. She did not ask questions. She simply watched. I took a slow breath and explained everything. The deposit box, Harold's letters, the trust, the years of planning that had taken place long before any of us knew how important it would become. Michael turned page after page in silence. The room felt strangely calm. No raised voices. No accusations. Just facts laid out one by one exactly as Harold intended. Eventually, Michael lowered the documents and stared at the table. Dad never told me any of this. He did not tell many people, I replied. He wanted the truth protected until the right time. Vanessa finally spoke. So there was another trust all along? Her voice sounded careful. Yes, I answered. There was. She nodded slowly. And you are the beneficiary? I am. Another silence settled over the room. Through the dining room window, I could see leaves drifting across the yard Harold loved so much. For the first time in weeks, the sight did not fill me with sadness. Instead, it brought a sense of peace. Michael continued reading. Then he reached the section containing records of past inquiries. His face changed immediately. He looked up, then toward Vanessa, then back down again. Nobody said anything. They did not need to. The documents spoke clearly enough. Questions that had been asked. Information that had been requested. Patterns that had been noticed and documented years earlier. Harold had left a record of everything important. Not because he wanted conflict, because he wanted clarity. Eventually, Michael set the papers aside and leaned back in his chair. I do not know what to say, he admitted. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. You do not have to say anything right now. His eyes filled with emotion. I should have paid more attention. I should have asked more questions. Perhaps, I said gently. But your father understood people better than most of us. That is why he prepared. The afternoon stretched into evening. No dramatic confrontation occurred. No one stormed out. The truth itself was powerful enough. Before leaving, Michael stood and hugged me tightly. It was the first genuine embrace we had shared since Harold's funeral. I am sorry, Mom, he whispered. I know. After they left, I remained alone at the dining room table. The folders still rested where we had been sitting. Outside, the last light of day disappeared behind the hills. I thought about Harold's final letter, about the trust, about the key hidden beneath a folded handkerchief. Most of all, I thought about the promise he had repeated throughout our marriage. You will always be protected, Evie. For weeks, I believed that promise had been broken. I believed I had been forgotten. Instead, I discovered something remarkable. Harold had kept his word exactly as he said he would. He had simply protected me in a way none of us expected. As darkness settled around the house, I carefully closed the final folder and smiled. The search was over. The questions had been